Well, Zach, I was traveling this week and I was on my way back from the airport listening to a podcast, and it was all about kind of career trajectory and what it is people want to do with their career. And I thought it'd be a really interesting topic for us to discuss just because I feel like we're at two different places of our career, and having that different perspective would be really interesting.
I can't wait, Gabe. I'm a little sad you didn't listen to this podcast on your way home from the airport, but we can only watch so much game tape. But I know we've talked a little bit about this week, but I think I'm excited. I definitely want to deep dive into this with you.
Yeah, it was I always listen to our podcast, to your point, to make sure that I listen to the game tape. So don't worry, I listened to the WWDC episode that we did last week also. But
that makes one of us.
But I like to listen to other podcasts because I think there's lots of great inspiration that we can take out there. It's one of my favorite. It's probably my favorite other marketing podcast besides buffering, of course. Which is it's the Marketing Against the Grain podcast, which is produced by the folks at HubSpot. It's the CMO and their director of. They're like VP of marketing as well. It's a really interesting podcast. I would definitely recommend it. But the one that was this week's episode was with Wes Kao, who's a really interesting person. She worked with Seth Godin for a few years. She launched Maven, which is a kind of cohort-based learning academy. Really thoughtful person. She's a great LinkedIn and Twitter follow for anybody out there. But she was talking this week about, they went through a bunch of different topics, but the one that really kind of struck me was how to think about career progression and leadership versus being a high level individual contributor. And it got me thinking that, in corporate, especially when you're somebody who's a high performer, you end up getting pushed down this path of people leadership. And I think that's a big mistake, because there are some people who are going to be fantastic people leaders. And there are a lot of people who are going to be fantastic individual contributors and high-level individual contributors. And those two skill sets aren't necessarily always perfectly aligned. I know you're a bit earlier in your career, Zach, but as you think about career progression and where you want to go and the things that interest you, where do you think about this? How do you think about people leadership versus high-level individual contributors? Are these topics that you consider?
Yo, it's something I think about every day. No, not every day, but it's funny you bring this up, Gabe. So I'm almost 3 years into this corporate America role in tech, and it's actually a conversation I was having 6 months ago. Is do you take this people leadership route and make that your next step, or do you strive to become this high level IC? And at the time, I thought, oh, people leader, that's what I have to do. That's what I need to do. But the more I think about it, these past 6 months, I don't see that as a plan anymore. I'm really focused on this high level, as you mentioned, that high level IC role.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think you said something there that I think is really interesting, which is I kind of felt like I had to, and I think that's a very pervasive thought that happens with people working in corporate. It's you start your career, you start to build some credibility, you start to see the progression of where you can go, and people leader always feels like that natural progression of how you actually grow your career. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this topic today is I think there's a great opportunity for people to grow into those high-level individual contributor roles. And I like I said, I personally think it's a huge mistake that we just push everybody down this people leader path of, hey, if you want to grow your career, you've got to be a people leader. And like I said, I've worked for lots of great people leaders over my career. I've worked for not great ones as well. And there's folks who really probably shouldn't be leading people. It's a very difficult job. And just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. I think that's another really important point that people don't consider enough is, again, just because you think you can do something doesn't mean necessarily that you should if you don't actually enjoy it.
I think that's a good point, Gabe. And like I said, 6 months ago, this was like an exact conversation. This podcast episode is 6 months too late. We could have had a totally different perspective earlier this year. But like I mentioned, this was a conversation I was having. And I think there was a little bit of a push into that. Oh, like the next step is a people leader. There was that sentiment around it, and ultimately, again, I kind of made that decision that maybe someday, but not now. But I think, Gabe, you've kind of built your own path here with your high level IC, and I think that's a really cool thing you've done.
Well, I've certainly made a lot of mistakes over my career, and when I think back to where I was at, when I was, not to sound like 100 years old, but when I was your age, Zach, and when I was at your, that point in my career where I was starting to grow, starting to get some credibility and things like that, that path towards people leader was absolutely the path that I felt like I was going to be on. If you asked me, what do you want to do in business? What's your ultimate goal? If you asked me that when I was in my mid 20s, I would have said, I want to be, a leader a leader in finance, right? I want to be a finance leader. I want to be managing all of the budgets. Maybe not necessarily at the CFO level. I didn't necessarily have that desire, but probably like right below that, director of finance, something like that, with a team of people working for me and, analyzing a bunch of financial statements and doing all that kind of fun stuff. I am at a very different place in my career now than I was when I was in my sort of mid 20s thinking about what that ultimate goal was. So you're right. I have had sort of a weird path, but it's been, I think, a very interesting path for me, and it's helped me learn a lot.
Man, that C-level executive, I don't want to say that was a dream. Maybe it is a dream, but that was something that was very much top of mind, even in college, right? Everyone wants to graduate, start their career and level up to that C-level vice president, whatever role you want. But man, that was absolutely the dream at one point.
I got a question for you, Zach, just because this is something that I feel like has a lot more cachet now than it did back in the day. But there's this whole idea of being a founder, right? Like there's all of these people that want to call, that either call themselves founders or, whatever, or want to be founders. When you were in college, did you have people who were, looking to branch out into entrepreneurship, who wanted to kind of describe themselves as founders? I would just be curious about that because it's something that didn't really exist.
Not for the label. I mean, you go on LinkedIn and everyone's a founder of something. It infuriates me, right? Like I just sent you a great example last week that I can't remember what it was. It was so funny, but it's actually a program we had at the University of Wyoming, and I still, to this day, I think of, could I start my own company? Could I found some kind of project? Could I be the founder? And I have friends who really focus on sustainability initiatives that we've talked about this. We've thrown the idea around a little bit. So I think there's a little bit of a dream there. Nothing, nothing set in stone. Again, not for the label, but I think I see it all the time. People do want, again, not so much the title, but they want that path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's there's an ego component of that too. And I think that's where a lot of people fall down around this whole leader versus high level IC thing too. There's absolutely an ego component of leadership, right? And wanting to be perceived as a leader. And I think that the mistake that we tell people, the mistake that we force onto people, especially those that are early in their career, is the only way you can be a leader in an organization is to be a people leader. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, a big mistake that we push onto folks. I consider myself a leader in the organization that I work with. I think if you talk to my peers, they would consider that as well. And I'm not trying to
I was just going to back you up on that, but I absolutely think you have a unique role here, because I think there's a lot of people that do look up to you at this company. But again, how many direct reports do you have today?
0. I have 0. And so I would, I'm not a people leader, right? And I think there's a component of just, being confident enough in yourself to know that, okay, the things that I'm bringing to the organization that I work for are beneficial, and that's how I make myself a leader, not by doing the people leader thing. And again, people leadership, it's a really hard job. I have done people leadership in the past, and frankly, I didn't like it. It was very, very difficult, and there were just components of it that I very much did not enjoy. So, but because I felt like that was the path that I needed to go down in order to progress, I sort of made that mistake. And part of the reason that I wanted to kind of talk about this today was because I feel like I want to help people avoid making that mistake. If you feel like you want to be a leader in an organization in a different way, that's awesome. You can still do that, and you can still do that by being a high-level individual contributor, not a people leader.
I think that's very well said, Gabe.
So the other topic that I wanted to just kind of jump in here, Zach, and I'm curious to hear your perspective on this too, is use my air quotes here, strategy, and how people think about strategic thinking versus strategic doing. And this sort of goes back to that ego thing as well of, the founder thing that Zach and I were just talking about as well. People want to think about big S strategy versus small S strategy. And what I mean by that is, with big S strategy, you're talking about, what are the goals of the organization, and what are the large, huge products that we're going to launch into market, those sorts of things. Those are big S strategy things. But the reality is that most people don't have an opportunity to have those types of conversations, but we can still be very strategic in the way that we think on a day-to-day basis. Zach, I see this with you every day. Like, I think you're very strategic in the way that you approach your role and approach the work that you do on a day-to-day basis. How do you think about kind of big S strategy versus small S, or strategic thinking versus strategic doing?
Well, it's funny because like with everything in life, I can't make a decision, right? So I was going to say, like, I'm in the middle, but I think, and Gabe, I think you'll agree with me here, but definitely lean into that strategic doer component.
I loved that term. So that was a term that came up in the podcast that I mentioned earlier, that Marketing Against the Grain podcast, is Wes mentioned the idea of a strategic doer. And I thought that was such a cool term because it really got me thinking about, what it is that I do on a day-to-day basis. And I think the thing, I would describe myself as a strategic doer. Like, I am somebody who likes to get my hands dirty. Like, I'm always in a spreadsheet. I was literally just doing that right before we jumped on this podcast, Zach, working on a project for my boss that, is, I would consider strategic, quite strategic, but it's something that somebody still needs to execute. And I think you're in that same boat where you're doing a lot of that work on a day-to-day basis too, where it's, yes, it's doing, but it's strategic doing in the ways that you're helping your customers, your clients, the organization overall. Am I thinking about that kind of through the right lens and how you think about the work that you do on a day-to-day basis?
I would say 100%. I always tell people everything I do is strategic, right? I won't do something just to do something. So the strategic doer that we've been talking about, I definitely align quite closally with what we perceive that as. Yeah.
I would agree, and I certainly would agree with you based on just me getting to work with you and kind of see. Obviously we don't work as closely together on a day-to-day basis. I was going to say, I don't know
if we've clarified this, but we're not even on the same team. Like, we're not even like the same organization at this company, right? So it's not like I pass you in the hall and we can talk about the latest team meeting. We're in like totally separate. I don't want to say like totally separate silos. We're not in silos here.
No.
But we're in totally separate projects, really. Or even that might be a stretch too. We don't have the same day-to-day conversations. As we used to. Now, we're on the same team. We're driving towards the same
goals. Yeah, so we were on the same team for a while, and that's where Zach and I got to know each other. And I was just frankly really impressed and excited to work with him on a day-to-day basis, which is why we wanted to start this whole silly podcast thing. But it's you're right. We're not necessarily talking about the same things every day. We're ultimately driving towards the same outcomes, which is successful outcomes for our customers and the folks that we get to work with. But and for the company that we work with, obviously. But you're right. We're not necessarily, in the weeds every single day in team meetings and things like that.
Gabe, do you remember the first time we met? Like, do you remember this now? Because I actually do. And it was actually in the interview process. I think you remember like the panel presentations, right? Mm-hmm. And it was right with like the 4th of July weekend. It was legit like 3 years ago. Because I remember I finished that panel.
You're right.
I finished that panel, I got in my car, and I drove 10 hours to Montana to see family. But I remember that, and I remember like meeting the people on the team at that same time and, trying to figure out who was who. And then, I started the company now, and somehow you're still, every day there's a new Teams chat or, a new piece of tech, AI, whatever that may be that we're discussing or, thinking strategically about. And I think, again, that goes back to your strategic doing.
Yes.
Again, something we do every day.
Well,
I see it in you as
this,
well.
Yeah, and this gets kind of to another topic I wanted to dive into, which is sort of it's definitely related to this. And I also remember that conversation, Zach. I remember interviewing you, and I remember coming away from that conversation being extremely impressed. And I went to
Little did you know what was happening next.
Little did I know where this was going to go. But no, I went to our boss, who we both worked for at the time after you got hired, and said, that was the best presentation that I've seen in any of these case studies. We were making people do these case study interviews, which honestly, really good idea. When you're interviewing people, I would highly, highly, highly recommend that you do that. And again, I'm not a people leader, but I have interviewed a ton of people over the years, probably thousands of people at this point, which is insane to think about. But when you're interviewing people, it's really difficult to know what you're going to get out of somebody in a 30-minute or even a 60-minute interview of what their work style is going to be like and what they're going to produce. So at the time, we were hiring a lot of people into this particular part of the organization. And so what we started doing was making people do case studies and come back and do a case study presentation. And it didn't have to be, they could basically choose whatever they wanted, right? I think that was part of the strategic part of doing this, Zach, and I'd be curious to hear your perspective since you actually had to go through this process. But there wasn't a ton of direction on what it was that we were asking people to do. It was like, hey, we'd love to hear an example of a marketing example that you've used in a previous role or in some sort of, in something, to come back and tell us how you were able to drive a specific outcome, how you're able to go through and do this. I'm right in that there wasn't a ton of guidance in that. Yes.
I really want to say it was a paragraph and maybe a few bullet points, even. Like, it was very limited. And I remember preparing for that. Step one was panic and like, what do I do, right? And then step two was like, actually look at like what I've done. I think I did mine on digital banking at the time and some different initiatives. Gabe, I wish I would have like been with you in my last role because I had all the Excel spreadsheets with all this data. I track everything, right? And at Calix, they've always said like, oh, if you don't track it, it's a hobby. One of our executives has said that. And
I love that quote. Yes, if you don't measure it, it's just a hobby. I think that's an absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and even in my role today, it's how I measure successful outcomes, or even the non-successful outcomes, right?
True.
Any outcome. But going back to that, luckily I had tracked this data and was able to present on that. But I really did like the case study. It was a lot to put together, but again, I was able to bring in like tangible work I've done and say, hey, outside of my resume, outside of this one piece of paper, this is what I've done, these are the results, this is the impact, and this is what I can do. So I did enjoy that.
Yeah, and it again speaks to that strategic doing, right? Because you understood all of the aspects of what it was that actually took to put that together, you were in that strategic doer role. And that to me speaks to kind of these next bullets that I wanted to go through, Zach, which was, if you want to be a strategic doer, there are some baseline things that you need to understand. And you showed all of those things during that interview process, which is deeply understanding the business that you work in. That's sort of step one. If you don't deeply understand the goals, the outcomes that you're looking to drive, all of those for the business that you're working in, what are we even doing here, right? That's sort of step one. But I think you'd be surprised that many people actually don't deeply understand those things and don't really fully understand.
Gabe, in our role, I guess I would say both of our roles today, it's deeply understand our customers' businesses as well, right?
Yes.
It's not just us knowing what the company objectives are. It's of course, flows down, cascades down into the people we work with every day.
100%. And yes, could not agree with you more on that. It is deeply understanding the problems that your customers are facing and how the solutions that you as an organization are bringing to market are going to help them solve those problems. That is extremely important because if your problem is misaligned to what the customer is actually trying to do, then it's just going to be an unsuccessful outcome.
And the next one here, Gabe, this is something I think you and I are very good at. We talk all the time is understanding industry topics and trends, because that's going to add value into the conversation, right? Like, I like to keep up to date on what Starlink is doing, because that's an impact, or what the FCC is doing. There's always something new there. What the competitors are doing.
It's hard to do that just because it's boring as crap. But yes, I agree.
Well, some may think, and then like the latest technology developments too. Gabe, this is something we do all the time. Like the midday text. Like, hey, did you see this new article on this piece of technology or this new development in this space, whatever that may be. I think staying on top of that is very valuable as well.
Well, and this is like kind of weirdly tactical, but no matter what industry you work in, there's probably a friend or a colleague that you have that works in that same industry, maybe even works at the same company, like Zach and I have, who is also a weirdo and kind of a nerd about this stuff, right? You can probably find that person. And when you do find that person, you can exponentially grow your knowledge by sharing information with that person. So I think the reason that you and I do a good job of this, Zach, is because we're constantly sending each other stuff, just information, right? It could be technology information. It could be marketing information. It could be industry information. It's just whenever we see anything, one of us sends it to the other. And it's difficult to keep on top of all of this stuff. But if you've got a person or maybe a group of people that are also interested in these topics, like crowdsource it. You know what I mean? You have an opportunity to actually crowdsource some of this information and learn in a lot more efficient way. So, for folks who are early in their career or even folks who are, at the midpoint of their career, I think it's so important to have colleagues that you enjoy talking to about this kind of stuff. And even outside of work hours, text each other stupid technology memes because it helps us stay up to date on, what's going on in the broader world of tech.
I couldn't agree more. There's actually a leader here, and this kind of leads into our next point here, is, when you're working on a specific project. Gabe, do you want to talk us through this next one? I've got a great example here, but I want you to kind of walk us through this last item here.
Yeah, well, it's all of those things that we just talked about. Deeply understanding the business that you work in, deeply understanding the problems that your customers are trying to solve, staying up to date on all of those industry topics and trends. And then when your leader or somebody in the organization gives you a specific project, you've got to tie it back to all of those things that we just talked about during the execution of that project. That is what becoming a strategic doer is. That's by tying all of those things back to the project that you're actually working on, it allows you to bring strategy into that execution. And that's a part where I think a lot of people fall down, is they just look to do instead of considering all of those things that they probably know, but they're just trying to get a project done. And so they don't end up bringing all of those other things into the conversation.
Yeah. And thinking back about these past few items we talked about, there's one leader here who I work with a lot, and I'll pitch this idea of something, and it's almost always followed by, that's amazing. Can you tell me more? Can you dive deeper? Why? It's pushing me for that why, and I do like being pushed for that additional information. It's something that I'm learning how to do myself now, just to really get to the importance of a project. Why are we doing something? Again, that strategic component. Combined with that strategic doer now. So being pushed as to what's the impact, why would we do this? Being able to really explain the desired outcome. And again, I guess the reason for that initiative.
Yeah. And this is where great leaders can be so fantastic, right? And I said I've worked for some really great leaders over the years. And I've also just seen leadership in lots of different places. I was on a Zoom call with a prospect a couple of weeks ago, and I was so impressed with the leader on the call, who we went through the presentation. We were, kind of talking to them about, a particular thing that we wanted them to buy. And we got to the end of the presentation, and it would have been very easy for that leader to just talk over their direct reports that were on that call. But when it got to the point of, what do you guys think? What do you guys think about next steps? Things like that. This person gave their team space to provide their feedback and guidance. And then this person built off of that. And I thought it was just such a perfect example to see it in real time, because so many times you see leaders just jump in, provide their feedback, and, then their team's like, oh crap, well, I better agree with this. Otherwise I'm disagreeing with my boss. But I think that's a perfect example, Zach, of like a great leader, and what you were talking about as well. That's another perfect example of a great leader. Somebody who's pushing you to do something more, excited for the fact that you went off and took all of the understanding, industry knowledge, research that you've done and are trying to push something beyond. That's a huge win. And that's where high level ICs and really good leaders, that's where I think you can really unlock amazing potential in people when you find a combination of those two types of people.
Yeah, it's almost as if you're being challenged to back up your views, back up your opinions, back up the strategy you're working on. Mm-hmm. The next item here, Gabe, this is a quote. I don't know if I heard it from you. I know my dad has said this before, but your boss doesn't want problems; they want solutions. And this is I love this. I think of this every day, right? Whether something's broken, not working right, not the outcome you want, or whatever that may be. I don't want to go to my leader and be like, we have a problem, good luck.
Exactly. That's the worst thing that you can do. And again, as we talk about, how you progress in your career and how do you get to the point where you can be this leader in the organization, high level IC, if that's the path that you want to go down, or even if you want to do the people leader path too, you can't just continue to bring problems to your boss. Your boss is dealing with a lot of problems. They're probably dealing with problems from their boss that have gotten pushed down, and potentially many people that are coming to them. So it's not a, hey boss, there's a problem. It's a, hey boss, we have a problem that we've identified. Here are 3 solutions that we could go down. I think this is the best solution based on this, and this. Do you agree? And if not, let me know why, and then we can discuss. But that is a very different conversation versus just, hey boss, stuff is broken.
It makes me cringe. I don't I don't like to see like, is this broken? Is this working? I don't like that. Gabe, this is something you and I have done, I want to say every week, but what's the solution here? Like, maybe it's not the solution, maybe it's an option here, but I really like coming to your leadership with a potential solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's got to be. And the way that I think people can get better at this and just better at work in general, this is a topic that was discussed on the podcast as well. I keep going back to this podcast. It was such a great one for all of this, for this entire topic and just leadership in general. But one of the terms that was discussed on there was side quests and not side hustles. And I loved that term. I'm not sure which term I love more, strategic doer or side quest, but both of those are absolutely fantastic.
I use side quest all the time. So
really? Oh, I had never heard it before.
Oh, I think my friends and I use it all the time. And I think like where it comes from, it's definitely a meme, but like, like video games when like there's like a side mission or again, a side quest that kind of distracts you from the main goal. I see this all the time in different like corporate America memes or just any meme in general, but it's like, this famous person is out here doing side quests because they're, this movie star who's out, doing something totally unrelated or whatever that may be. But that's kind of where that came from. But I totally agree. I mean, Gabe, look at the side quest we've done in the last couple weeks, between the two of us. There's opportunity there to present a solution that, I don't want to say it's outside of our day-to-day roles, but obviously there's a problem. We've identified potentially a solution through a side quest.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think of the podcast as a side quest. I feel like this podcast helps us keep up to date on a lot of the things that we were talking about earlier that you need to keep up to date on. What's happening in technology, what's happening in the industry. And when you're forced to put something out into the world that talks about your opinion around a specific thing, you kind of need to understand it. Otherwise, you're going to feel like a complete moron just getting on and saying a bunch of stuff that you actually don't, know a lot about. So this podcast, I think, is a great side quest because it's forced us to be more thoughtful, I think, in what is our opinion around some of these specific things. Like, I think about the WWDC episode that we did last week. That was really helpful to, I think about, how does Apple think about their business? What are the opportunities that come in here with, Apple Intelligence coming to market, all of those sorts of things. But it allows us to kind of think about it all through that lens. And all of that knowledge that we gain through these side quests end up helping us tremendously in the day-to-day conversations that we have because we're gaining knowledge from all of these different places. And so I'm with you, even if tangentially related to your job, there's still a massive benefit that you can get out of it, and understanding just what's going on in the broader world, and how to bring that back to your day-to-day work life.
Absolutely. And Gabe, look at the strategic doing we're doing too. We've got this podcast. We rebranded it too. Keep in mind.
True.
We go through, we edit the content, we plan the content, we publish the content. Then we take it there, and you do the blog post as well. But a lot of these are best practices that we've learned over the years that we can now implement ourselves, as well as with the people we work with.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, they're great learnings that we can take back to to other folks for sure. Well, and so the last topic that we had here, Zach, was, and this sort of leads nicely into this conversation, which is experience. So are you defining, I guess the question would be is, how do we define experience? Is experience just the number of years that you've been working in a particular job or for a particular company or doing a particular thing? Or is experience all of the knowledge that you've gained, potentially even over a shorter period of time, because you have been willing to do all of these side quests, side activities to expand your knowledge base? And I think about this just in my own life, Zach, because I've been working in corporate America for 25 years now, basically, right? Zach, you're a little less than that, but someday you'll have that level of experience too, and at a point, everybody will have that. Everybody will have a number of years of experience, so if there's a bunch of other people that are going for a particular role, that all are in their mid 40s and that have a similar background as me, how do you separate yourself, right? Like what are the experiences that you bring to the table that are separating you from just, oh, this person has 25 years of experience too?
It's funny. There's a comedian, I cannot think of who it was, but they basically said like, oh, you graduated, congrats on accomplishing something that X% of the country does. And it goes back to what you just said, is when you graduate, I remember my graduating class, there was I don't know how many thousand people in it. Cool, we all had degrees, we all had this degree, some of us had the same degree. What makes us different, right? We have college on our resume, we have high school on our resume now. What else? And luckily, I had various internships and then through COVID, again, the job in banking to add that experience to my resume. But there had to be something to make me stand out, right? Because that college degree or the 3 years of this company now is not going to make me stand out from the next person who also graduated and also has been at a company for X years. So that's where I think we talked about like the side hustle thing or like the tangible work as well, but doing things like that, being able to differentiate yourself from the next person in line, I think is huge. Yeah,
agreed. And it's there's the classic problem of not having experience at the beginning of your career, and people wanting to, well, it's an entry level role, but we need 10 years of experience in these three specific things, and it's unfortunate that happens. And it sort of goes back to a conversation that we had, Zach. Oh my gosh, I think it might have been one of our first episodes, even maybe first or second episode, but we were talking about the huge percentage of people that come out of college with marketing degrees that are not working in the marketing field, even 5 years after graduation. Because you're right, there are a lot of people coming out of college with a piece of paper that says, hey, I know how to do some of these things, but what are you going to do to actually separate yourself earlier in your career? How are you going to be strategic about the way that you execute? Going back, and not to continue to blow smoke up Zach here, but going back to the way that he presented himself during the interview process and was thoughtful about the case study that he brought to the table, that was a perfect example of what strategic doing can get you, because it completely separated him from everybody else. So because he had that general baseline knowledge, but because he had also went the extra mile around thinking deeply about each one of these outcomes, that was how he was able to separate himself. And I think that's true whether you're at the beginning of your career trying to break into a specific company or break into a specific role, or whether you're like me 25 years into your career and trying to frankly just do the best job that you can and drive the best outcomes. if you're not thinking really strategically about how you're actually going to execute strategically, then you're leaving yourself a massive gap, and you're going to just that's where you do put a cap on your career, right? And going back to a conversation that we had at the very beginning of this episode, Zach, and sorry, I know I've been talking for a long time, but it speaks to when you decide not to be a people leader, you sort of feel like you've put a cap on your career. And that was sort of a difficult thing for myself to reconcile at the time, was like, oh crap, because I don't want to go down this people leader path, I feel like I've artificially kind of capped my career, right? My earning potential, what I can be seen as a leader in the organization. But over the last few years, I've started to realize that actually, no, I haven't done that. I just have to think about it differently. And I need to think about how I strategically do more to continue to progress my career in just a different way.
I agree with you, Gabe. Like I said 6 months ago, this was a conversation I was having. There's a lot of people that I would view as leaders, Gabe, yourself being included, who are not, technically people leaders. Gabe, we talked, you have 0 direct reports today, but I feel like, without explicitly saying that, people would have assumed the other, you do have directs. But I think this is a fantastic conversation, Gabe. Again, I wish we would have had this episode, a year ago, but I think there's a lot of great takeaways from here. I really like the conversation on the strategic doing as well.
Same. I love that term so much. And that's really what sparked this whole conversation and just an opportunity to talk about this, because I don't think there's as much conversation about this type of thing in business as there should be. And again, making the right decision for your career path based on what is actually right for you. If you want to be a people leader, that's awesome. And I'm so glad that there are people that are willing to do that job. And I've seen so many great people leaders drive really positive outcomes for organizations and just positive outcomes for people's lives. And I'm really happy that there are people that are excited about doing that. Again, that ain't me. But if you want to head down this other path, then you got to do it the best way that you possibly can. And approaching it from a strategic perspective and thinking really deeply about how you're going to drive outcomes is, I think, the way you're going to actually be successful in that type of role.
I love it, Gabe. I think this was a great episode. I'm okay with you watching and listening to other podcasts. I'm guilty as well, but I'm glad you did say this was your favorite. I'll be honest, I haven't done a good job of watching. I used to watch our episodes. I feel like a movie actor now, right? I used to watch the films I was in and think of how I could do things better. Whereas now it's just I don't want to know how that turned out. But I think this side hustle, Gabe, as we talked about, has been fantastic in keeping us up to date and industry trends, marketing trends, engagement trends as well. So I'm happy we could have this conversation today, in addition to all the content we talked about this year as well.
Yeah, it's been a blast, man. I love having these conversations, and like you said, I'm totally with you. It definitely helps. It forces us to stay up to date with stuff, which is great.
Which, I mean, we'll be on. We would have done it either way, but
True.
It keeps us honest.
But yes.